brilliance of Intel's 14th generation is limited only by its ability to believe that they were worth launching. Now we're reviewing the Intel i9-14900K. They have incremented the number from 13 to 14, and the frequency's gone up a little bit. Now it's 6 gigahertz for the maximum turbo on the 14900K, which is just high enough to clear the bar for something that marketing can grasp at to talk about in its promotional materials. Now, we were so disappointed in the i7-14700K in our last review that we made a whole weird intro. It went a little off the rails. This enables companies everywhere to make bigger number better, but without all of the hard work of making the number bigger better. But that's the trade for spending a week on products like these. Now, we're back to try our luck with the 14900K. And this thing, it pulls a ton of power, just like the 13900K did, but that hasn't really changed much. And it now runs at, again, 6 gigahertz. So we're going to be talking about if the 14900K is worth considering and some of its competitors, the closest ones being probably the 78X3D in gaming, which is a lot cheaper right now. But anyway, let's get started with the Raptor Lake Refresh 14.9. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li and the O11D Evo XL. The O11D Evo XL builds upon the long-standing strengths of the O11D series by adding new features, like a rotated GPU layout to showcase the most important part of a build. The Evo XL also uses a removable motherboard tray that can adjust for different heights, making it tunable for every style. Additionally, these cases use Lian Li's compartmentalized approach to design to keep cables cleanly hidden behind the back of the case. Learn more at the link in the description below. Quick overview and specs first. So the 14900K is for sale right now, the day before you all will see this video, the day before launch, for $600 on Newegg. It's kind of implied that that's maybe like a pre-order low price. We've seen it for $625 elsewhere. So by the time this video posts, the CPU will be out, and it should be $600 to $625 or so. The 14900K at $600 most directly competes with Intel's own 13900K, which is $550. And then AMD's strongest gaming competitor is the 7800X3D, which has been around $350 to $400 all week. The strongest production competitor from AMD is the 7950X, commonly priced under $600. The AMD R9 7900X is another competitive option that's $425 to $450 right now, depending on where you look. We've already detailed the basics for the 14 series. Just a reminder again, it's going to be hard to break this habit for us and other reviewers too, but this isn't really a generation. So 14th gen is kind of just a shorthand way to say 14 series, but ultimately this is the same architecture. This is not deserving of a new generational number. We will sometimes refer to it as 14th gen, but that's really not what it is. So don't expect that much. Unfortunately, Intel has misbranded this in a way where it will lead people to expect more than what they're getting. We're going to start with power draw. Power consumption is insane on the i9 CPUs, and we have some cool numbers we can share looking back at just i9s, which haven't actually existed that long in Intel's history. So let's start there. Let's start with thermals. A quick reminder here, the temperature that comes out of a data log for a CPU is not like a synthetic benchmark score. It's going to change a lot, and that's entirely based on the motherboard and the cooler, plus the workload used for testing. In our test, we use Blender rendering for a realistic and heavy daily use case. We also test with a 360mm Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 at 100% fan and pump speeds. You can find our acoustic and other thermal data and our cooler reviews for that. Finally, other than controlling the board to not blast MCE or something, we basically let it do its thing with regard to voltages and operate under Intel's official guidance for how these CPUs are supposed to behave. The Asus Z790 Dark Hero served as the test platform for the 14900K. Here's the chart. First, with the 14900K logging every core at steady state and tested in a 21C environment, we ended up with temperatures that were shockingly consistent core to core. This is a lot better than we've seen in the past from Intel. That much is typically the assembly quality and how the IHS is attached to the silicon. Our peak-to-peak delta for P cores is around 4 degrees. We're in the 70s. That's with a 360mm liquid cooler and a 100% core workload for Blender. Now, it's at least mostly under control here. In gaming scenarios, this would be lower. In a prime type scenario, it would be higher. We've seen others that have been in the 90s, and depending on the cooler that was used by the reviewer and the motherboard, that's completely possible. The Dark Hero is logging via software as having a 1.172 V-core. If that number can be trusted from hardware info, that'd be low enough to explain some of this relatively low thermal performance compared to some of the other figures that we've seen. But sometimes this number isn't an accurate representation. Looking at some other temperatures, the 14700K ran higher overall on this workload despite being in the same board and under the same cooler. Some of this is likely the stim quality though, and the lid attachment by Intel. We've seen that this can change a lot unit to unit in the past, and this difference would easily be explained by that. Given our years of data we've collected on CPUs with the same methods, we can provide some interesting perspective using a look back at all the i9 CPUs we've tested recently. Remember that the i7 existed as the top end before this, but we have that generational comparison chart in our 14700K review. Here's the i9 chart. The 14900K's 287 watts is close to the highest we've tested, and aside from the 13900K, it is the highest stock draw we've tested. The 13900K isn't far off though, they're about the same. Dating back to the original Intel i9 desktop CPU, the i9-9900K, power consumption was as low as 94 watts for all-core and Blender. The 11900K was 127 watts. It's about the same as the 10900K before it. The Intel HEDT CPUs, like the 10900X and the 10980XE, pushed closer to 200 watts. That the 10980XE was lower power consumption than the 14900K is crazy, considering how the 10980XE was received at the time. It was seen as this mind-blowingly power-hungry chip, but also a top performer with its 18 cores. We see a generational climb with the 12900K going to 244 watts, then 275 watts with the basically pre-OC KS SKU, and there's a clear trend line here, and it's going up. The difference between the 13.9 and 14.9 could be process maturity. It's just as likely, though, a slight change in the voltage provision by the motherboard. It could also be error. We're really not that far apart here. They're basically the same. Here's a look at the more comparative power numbers. We measured the 14900K again at 287 watts at the EPS 12-volt cables, meaning that the CPU and VRM efficiency losses are the only things measured here. That has it about the same as our 13900K, which was 295 watts previously. The 14700K's 284 watts is about the same. AMD's 7800X3D, meanwhile, maxes out at 86 watts all-core. Although, to be fair, Intel won't be at 100% CPU load in games like it is here, but neither will AMD. AMD still overall here is advantaged, though. The 7950X CPU pulls 251 watts without eco mode, also below Intel's 14900K. This is a power-hungry CPU, and they're only going to get harder to cool if Intel keeps going this direction. Overclocking also becomes more challenging, although maybe in a new way. In this case, the new way is that the cooling begins to hit diminishing abilities to tame this power draw. Undervolting makes way more sense to do that instead, and Intel boards traditionally have run way too high voltage even at stock, so there's room for improvement. Power efficiency testing will help us understand what all this really means. For this number, we're calculating the energy consumption during a Blender workload. Our metric is watt hours, which allows us to see how much energy consumption there is for a CPU to complete the same work. That means we're normalizing for the workload, not the time, and lower is better. The 14900K is at the lower end of the chart. It's more efficient than the 13900K, the 14700K, 129K, and the 137K, and AMD's 5800X, barely. But it's far below top performers like the 5950X or 7950X for efficiency. It's not the least efficient we've tested, but Intel is pushing its thermal envelope and power draw increasingly high. Blender is up next. Because this one spawns one render tile per thread on the CPU, it scales well with higher thread count processors. And that is why the 14900K is 100% identical to the last generation 13900K. Great. That's super exciting. Thanks, Intel.
Thanks, Steve.
This has the 7950X and its 6.4 minute result ahead of the 14900K with a 12% time reduction. Against the 7900X, Intel's lead is 15%. And against its own 14700K, it leads by 8.8% time reduced. This would be interesting if all of those numbers weren't already exactly the same by comparing it to the 13900K. This difference is massive.
You can literally see it.
In 7-zip file compression testing, the 14900K completed 191,000 MIPS, or millions of instructions per second. It's ahead of the 13900K by, get ready for it, 0.6%. We're actually going to throw it over to Intel to ask them what they think of this improvement.
Back to you, Steve.
So again, we're basically re-reviewing the 13900K. Against the 14700K, that's an 11% improvement. if you can call total and utter stagnation an improvement. In decompression, it's a little bit better at least. The 14900K improves over the 13900K by 4% here, not too distant from the 5950X, and leading the 14700K by 23%. Adobe Premiere benchmarking via the Puget suite is up now. This one has the 14900K at 842 points in aggregate, leading the 13900K by 1.7%, so nearly margin of error, basically. Truly, irrevocably, an engineering masterpiece. Marvels like this are what Intel will be remembered for, when the improvement is so large that we need a decimal place just to illustrate that it's not within our own test variance. That's when you know it's a good generational uplift. In fact, it's so exciting that we're not even going to talk about any other production tests. Time to move on to games. The production numbers were just so staggering and impressive, we couldn't bear to look at them anymore. It was overwhelming us with some kind of emotion and almost brought us to tears, just how CPU the CPU is. So we're going to move to games now, and we expect great results. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the 14900K ran at 656 FPS average. That has it ahead of the 13900K by 1.65840049597024%, a world record for length of a percentage number in a gamer's Nexus review video. Remarkable. The positioning has it just ahead of the 5800X3D, so Intel gets its wish. It is now technically ahead of the last-gen AMD X3D CPU. The 7000 series still leads, but it's the small steps that count, like beating something based on an architecture from a few years ago. Against the 14700K, the 14900K is also under a 2% benefit. At 1440p, it's even more riveting. The 14900K leads the 13900K by 0.2 FPS average. As you all know, Rainbow Six is a highly competitive game, so that 0.2 FPS matters. We should give some perspective here. The extra 0.2 FPS average means your average frame time is shorter by about 0.0008 milliseconds, since the average Redditor's reaction time is actually 0.0001 milliseconds, which is at least 1.4 million milliseconds faster than their thought processing time. This is a difference that the most advanced among us can feel. In F1 2023, the 14900K measured at 422 FPS average, ahead of the 13900K by 1.1%. The difference genuinely, actually, is impressively tiny. If you're picking between this and a 14700K, you'd be looking at about a 3.7% improvement moving to the i9 in this game, so not worth thinking too much about. Intel is struggling to meet AMD's 5800X3D performance, which sits 7% ahead of the new i9, and the 7800X3D is 21% ahead. At 1440p, we get the usual reduction of scaling as a result of imposing a GPU limitation at the top end of the stack, so let's move forward. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now. In this one, we see again that the X3D CPUs are soaring to the top of the charts. The 14900K landed at 110 FPS average, gracing us with a 2.2% uplift over the 13900K, while allowing the 7800X3D a lead of 10.4%. The latter here actually a meaningful number. The 5800X3D isn't far behind Intel, and it ends up about tied with the 14700K. 1440p, predictably, is the same. We're CPU bound even at the higher resolutions in this game, so the 14900K's positioning remains largely unchanged. In Phantom Liberty at 1080p, the 14900K's 168 FPS average result had it ahead of the 13900K by 3.2%. The 14700K and the 13700K are within run-to-run variants of each other, as we mentioned last round. All the Intel CPUs are getting clustered around the same spot here, but the 7800X3D, the 5800X3D, and the 7700X remain stronger options in this one. You can learn more about the other data and the testing for this one for Phantom Liberty in our 14700K review. We'll skip 1440p since it's more of the same. Final Fantasy gives Intel some hope. It tends to do well in this game. The 14900K is now formally the chart leader. They've done it. Intel wins. We'll stop here. Review over. The headline is now clear for us. Intel i9-14900K is the new gaming king, with a crushing 3.05% lead over the 13900K and a likewise mind-bending 5.47% lead over the 14700K. This battle has long been decided. But to be fair, this is a title where you'd want to favor Intel if you expect to be CPU bound. The lead is a more meaningful 23% over the 7800 X3D for the 14900K. It's just that that lead isn't that much different than what they already had. The 1440p scaling is about the same for this game. The frame rate has marginally changed, but we're still CPU bound and they still stack up largely the same way. Stellaris is up now, measuring simulation time instead of FPS. We mentioned this in our 14700K review, but the game isn't scaling much once we're at around 30 seconds for simulation time. They're all jumbling up to look the same due to other limitations. In our 14700K review, we asked those of you who are serious players to email us your most complex late game save file to our tips@gamersnexus.net inbox so we can see if we can find more scaling in the game for the next round. In this Stellaris chart though, there's no difference. But for once, it's not the fault of Intel's so-called 14th so-called gen, it's just that we're bound elsewhere. It might be hard to tell 0% generational scaling from 0% test scaling, but it's just 0% test scaling. Starfield is another one that shows scaling for Intel, sort of, or at least Intel has managed to wedge itself at the top of the chart to supplant those pesky X3D CPUs. The 14900K's 132 FPS average has it 2.8% ahead of the 13900K, with the 14700K not meaningfully far behind. You'd never notice the difference between 126 and 132 FPS average, especially in this game, so selecting between them isn't that important. The lead over the 7800 X3D is at least more meaningful at 15% improved. Scaling is similar at 1080p high with a lower FPS due to a heavier workload, but overall the lineup is mostly unchanged. So wrapping up the 14900K review then, we're just disappointed. I mean, it's not, there's very little change in stock performance. This isn't deserving of a new number. It's going to be confusing for consumers who don't follow this stuff as closely as you all do. And we would say it's pretty simple where if you're in the market for a CPU like this, if it's significantly cheaper, like $50 or whatever it is right now, cheaper, just get the 13900K if you were already going to buy that one and use the $50 somewhere else. If you were not set on which CPU to buy, well then all these charts have brand new numbers and data that we've just collected with a brand new test suite. So you have all the tools you need to look through AMD's competitors. And we would say the 78X3D deserves the most attention in gaming. 58X3D still deserves attention if you're on AM4. Wouldn't necessarily build a new platform with it right now, but yeah, AM4 boards can be found pretty cheap too. So maybe that's all right depending on where you are. Those are the kind of top gaming competitors. For production, 7950X, kind of 7900X, but realistically, the 13900K has done pretty well in production over the years, and the 14900 is just another one of those. So the short version of this is anywhere we or other reviewers would have recommended a 13900K, it's the same thing. So the same rules apply, the difference being the price. If it's more expensive, you get the cheaper one. That's it. So this whole product launch just feels kind of like grasping at straws, and probably in the 14600K review, I'm going to open it with more of a monologue talking about that, because otherwise it's just going to be more of the same lackluster performance improvement, and we have some things to talk about. So check back for that one. Otherwise, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help support our testing efforts. This kind of work takes a lot of hands-on time from the whole team for the past week now. And you buying things like our mod mats, our solder mats, coaster packs, shirts, anything from the store, or going to patreon.com/gamersnexus and throwing us a few bucks, that helps us out with the next one. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.